Good afternoon, everybody. This is our IEEE-USA Legislative Washington update for late August. And August traditionally is a time when Congress and Washington, D.C. shuts down. But this is a presidential election year in the middle of a COVID pandemic. And so we have lots of exciting stuff going on to talk about. So we shall get right in it. Before we do, I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA, reporting from the IEEE-USA, the very lonely IEEE-USA offices in Washington, D.C. And with that, as many of you know, the Democrats just completed their convention where they successfully nominated Senator Joe Biden to be their candidate for president this fall, not too surprising. In past elections, we would now spend a great deal of time talking about the Democrats' party platform, which traditionally established what it was that the party believed in and what the party intended to accomplish if it got itself elected. In modern times, the party platform is kind of vaguely interesting, but not at all important because candidates typically just completely ignore it. Still, worth taking a glance at, seeing what the party thinks. The Democrats have their platform out. These typically come out just before the convention starts, which was the case in this case. A lot of stuff in there. Party platforms are just kind of a list of policies, most of which are designed to appeal to pieces of that party's election coalition. Both political parties in the United States are big umbrellas of groups which don't necessarily agree with each other on things. And so the platform allows the parties to find something that everybody likes, throw it in together. There you go. You got a platform. A lot of good stuff in the Democratic Party's platform for IEEE members. Good language, not surprisingly, on research funding, education, K through 12 up through university. Some very good language on universities, aid for students, aid for research, infrastructure projects, all good stuff. There's a nice section on NASA and the need to invest in space exploration. What's interesting about the NASA section is that it almost could be in the Republican platform as well. The two parties actually are fairly close on their priorities for space, which is one of the reasons why NASA is doing so well at the moment, and American space exploration is doing so well as well. Two little pieces of concern in the platform. One is a kind of oblique reference to the H-1B program that is a little more positive than I would like. It's really a comment about the president's visa programs. And so I understand why it's in there, but we want to make sure the Democrats don't start thinking that just because the president doesn't like H-1Bs that they should like it. Of more concern is a reference, sort of, to AB 5. AB 5, you'll recall, is the law out in California that regulates or that changes the regulations for independent contractors and consultants. It is a problem. Our members in California who are consultants are having a difficult time figuring out how to comply with it. A number have already lost contracts and lost jobs because of the law. And unfortunately, the heart of AB 5 made it into the PRO Act, which is a bill that was passed by the U.S. House of Representatives this year, didn't go anywhere in the Senate. And there is a reference to supporting the PRO Act in the Democratic platform. What this means is we're going to need to do a more aggressive outreach to the Democratic Party to make sure they understand that, we don't care about Lyft and Uber drivers. We don't care about other types of contract laborers, which is what the bill is really designed to attack. But when you apply it to high-end IT consultants and engineering consultants, it becomes a real problem. And so we're going to need to do some work on that. Other than that, the platform's available online if you want to read it. It's just a list of policies. It's not designed to be read, really, but it gives you some interesting insight in kind of what the party insiders are thinking the public wants to hear from them. On the economy, a couple pieces of interesting data for those of you who, like me, like economic data. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, U.S. productivity was up 7.3% in the second quarter. Now, that is a seasonally adjusted annual rate, but 7% increase in productivity, even if it were extended to be over a year, is absurd. We normally measure productivity gains in tenths of a percent. And it is probable that outside of extraordinary circumstances, the US productivity cannot increase 7% in one quarter. Just too big, and already, frankly, too productive for that sort of growth. But as we've talked about before, the other two pieces of data that came out show us what's going on. Again, these are quarterly rates extended to be annual rates. So if the decline in the second quarter continued for one calendar year, we would have seen a 39% decrease in output and a 43% decrease in hours worked, both of which would be catastrophically bad. But the economy seems to be recovering, so that's not going to happen. But as we talked about before, what happened in April, May, June, and March, but that was the first quarter, is the United States shed a huge number of jobs in a very short amount of time. Those job losses were not randomly distributed across the economy, but were concentrated in segments of the economy that are not particularly productive. And I want to make it clear, I'm not saying the people there don't work hard or they don't contribute, but when you have someone, say a clerk in a retail store, a sizable amount of time is them just simply waiting for customers or helping customers who aren't necessarily buying, which in economic terms is not productive time. So what we did is we lost a huge number of low productivity jobs from the economy, which causes the average productivity to go up, which in normal times would be good, but in this case is not good in a major way. All of these numbers demonstrate that what COVID has done to our economy has made a complete mess of our economic statistics, because the US economy isn't supposed to move this fast. It's not supposed to change as fast as it did in March and April and May, which for people who are interested in this sort of stuff is fascinating, but it also gives us some insight into how the US economy is structured and how it works. So let's get into policy. The big policy debate was over COVID relief. You will recall in previous sessions, I said we expected Congress to reach a deal on the next COVID bill, which they didn't. Surprised me. I thought ultimately they would reach a deal. Instead, President Trump stepped up and took some executive actions to try to address some of the problems that should have been dealt with in the COVID bill. Now, there is a valid debate on whether the president stepping up and doing this through executive order is a good idea or not. Set that aside. This is what the president has done. President Trump has extended unemployment benefits essentially by declaring the entire country a natural disaster or national disaster. And thus he was able to tap FEMA funds to provide an additional $400 in unemployment relief to people who had lost their jobs. Of the $400, $300 is coming from the federal government, $100 has to come from the states, which has caused a few states to decline the additional money. South Dakota declined the additional money because the governor said, we don't need it. Our employment situation is so good, we don't need additional help, which is a nice situation to be in. Unfortunately, that doesn't apply to the other 49 states. So the president also temporarily deferred employee payroll taxes. That's the little percentage of money you pay into Social Security as part of your paycheck. There's a percentage of your paycheck that you pay and a percentage that your employer pays. The employer has to keep paying it. But the rest of us, up to $104,000 a year in income, will be able to not pay that starting at the end of the month, except that we're going to have to pay it eventually. The president simply deferred the payments. He didn't cancel them. He doesn't have the authority to cancel them. So this is going to create tax liability down the line, but it will help people immediately. The theory there is the economy is starting to recover. People are still hurting now, but by the time we get to January, a lot of those people will be back at work. A lot of people will be doing better. The economy will be growing again. And thus people will be able to afford to pay the taxes they didn't pay now. Don't know if that'll happen. Hope it does, but that's the basic theory. The president has announced he will be deferring student loan payments and interest until January. Those payments are already deferred until the end of September, so this isn't quite as urgent. But students will not have to make payments on their loans, and no interest will be charged on their loans until January. The students will have to make the payments, but they just won't have to do them till later. So the loans don't go away, they just get pushed off a little bit. It's not entirely clear how that program is going to work, by the way. The Department of Education is working out the details. The president has also announced he will do something on eviction relief to make it harder to evict people from apartments or houses at the moment. Again, there's no details on how that would work. It's not even clear the president has the authority to do it, but they're going to try. So what does all this mean? Well, I think what it means is there will be increased pressure on the Democrats to do something on COVID in September. I don't think the Democrats are going to want to go into the November election with President Trump being able to say, I did these things because Congress couldn't get their act together, more specifically because the Democrats couldn't get their act together. That's how the president will phrase it. With them being only able to say, yes, but the president didn't do enough. Response is, well, what did you do? And the answer is nothing. So nothing now. Of course, the Democrats and the Republicans have passed several other COVID relief bills earlier in the year. I'm just phrasing how the messaging will work. So the result of this is the Democrats are going to face some political pressure to do something. I actually think congressional Republicans will face the same pressure because they didn't do this either. And they have to get themselves reelected too. And so I think the president's actions ultimately will make it more likely something will be produced. Here's the problem. Congress doesn't have a lot of time to do this. And when you don't have a lot of time to negotiate things, the number of issues you can negotiate gets smaller. And I think what's happening is in June, in July, the next COVID bill was huge. There were all sorts of programs to help all sorts of things. And the range of issues is shrinking dramatically. There's going to be something on unemployment, almost certainly. There will be something to help kind of broadly the economy, maybe a renewal of the PPP program or some sort of small business relief. And then a couple other things. The airlines are now demanding additional money. They're talking about cutting back service in September dramatically if they don't get additional help. I don't know how that'll fly or not, whether that'll fly or not. But one of the things that is not being discussed currently is aid for universities. Universities have taken a bunch of financial hits because of COVID. Costs are up, revenue is down, and the universities had asked for a large chunk of money, $56 billion or so, for research. And this was to offset the additional costs caused by COVID on their research programs. And originally it was one of the top tier programs that looked like it would be funded in COVID, and it sort of dropped off the table. Now it can come back up. It has support in both parties and both chambers in Congress, but time's getting short. And if they start approaching the middle of September, the end of September, when all the legislators want to get back home so they can campaign to keep their jobs, if university relief hasn't been decided upon and agreed upon, it's easy to just drop until next year. And so we will still be working with Congress to try to make sure they understand the urgency of that aid, but the time is awfully short. Very quick update on the National Defense Authorization Act, which is a bill that will pass this year. Conferees have not been named, so we don't know who will negotiate the deal between the Senate and the House on this bill. But IEEE-USA has already started its grassroots outreach to people who we're pretty sure will be in the conference committee. We have sent letters to Senator McConnell and Senator Inhofe, or more specifically, the IEEE sections in Lexington and Louisville, Kentucky, Oklahoma City, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, sent letters on behalf of the residents of those states, the IEEE members in those states, asking them to support the Endless Frontier Act. We will be doing more of those letters and more of those outreach as soon as we know exactly to whom we should be sending those letters. Speaking of the Endless Frontier Act, we have two new co-sponsors in the House. The Endless Frontier Act is an amendment to the NDAA, but it's also a standalone bill. And we have two new co-sponsors, Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick, Republican from Pennsylvania, and Alyssa Slotkin, Democrat from Michigan. Two things to note about this. First is bipartisan support for this bill. That's always been a priority and always been important for this particular piece of legislation. Secondly, both both Congressman Fitzpatrick and Congresswoman Slotkin are relatively new. Fitzpatrick is in his second term. Slotkin just got elected 2 years ago, and both of them have very difficult reelection campaigns. The significance of this is that both of these legislators think their reelection campaigns will be improved if they support basic technology research. I happen to think they're right, but it's nice to know politicians are starting to realize the political value of supporting this research. This is a core goal of the Science is Us campaign, which we've talked about before, and I'll go into again in a few minutes. But it's nice to see the message is starting to get through to a few folks. Another NDAA amendment that IEEE-USA has been pushing is the National Artificial Intelligence Initiative Act. This is a bill. It was introduced earlier this year. IEEE-USA has been working on it for more than a year, and it does a couple things which are good. It sets a national strategy for developing, actually calls for a national strategy for developing and deploying AI, artificial intelligence systems, sets national research priorities and a national research strategy for AI. It either encourages or forces, depending on how you read the bill, greater interagency cooperation on AI deployment, which is important and difficult. It has a nice section on workforce development and K through 12 STEM education, teaching kids about AI and training adults to get into the AI business, both of which are very good and very important. And here's where it gets interesting. It has a section starting to try to make sure that AI systems deployed by the federal government in particular are both ethical and consider the societal impacts of the technology before they're deployed. IEEE Standards Association, through their ethically aligned designed system, have been thinking about this for a while and have a fairly well-developed program for certifying AI systems as being ethical and ethically developed. The National Artificial Intelligence Initiative Act picked up on that and includes language that will push companies and, more importantly, the government to approaching AI along the terms that IEEE standards has suggested. So that's what the bill does, the amendment does. But the significance of this bill is important to note. There have been dozens, probably hundreds of bills introduced in the last several years on artificial intelligence. Most of them and all of them that have passed are a little more than the government should think about this, do a study, look into, investigate. But it didn't really do anything about AI. It was just Congress trying to get its head around what AI was and how it should be handled. This bill isn't that. This is Congress's first step towards really providing a regulatory structure to keep an eye on AI technology. And so as such, it's a very important step. It's a very big step for Congress. It is in the House version of the NDAA, not the Senate version, but we know this bill has decent support in the Senate. And so it has a fairly good chance of making it into ultimately the final version of the NDA. And if it does, it will become law. And we're excited about that. President Trump released his federal research priorities document, which has a bunch of stuff. You can see the highlights there: public health, security and innovations, American leadership and industries of the future, which includes AI, quantum, communications, manufacturing, computing, lots of stuff that we care about. Prioritizes American security, energy and the environment, and American space leadership, all of which is fantastic. And you can read this online. There's a link up there if you want to see it. You should be aware, however, that most of this report, and the president does this every year, but most of this is verbatim what the president said last year, which is not necessarily bad. I mean, these are long-term research strategies and research goals. You wouldn't expect the president to come up with an entirely new set of priorities every year. But what is remarkable is a couple additions to it. The most important to us is a priority on low Earth orbit spacecraft, which was not in last year's version. Again, both the Republicans and the Democrats, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, are prioritizing development of space and prioritizing utilizing space for the country, which IEEE-USA is very excited about. A little project we're working on, again, we're starting to talk about 2021. The House is starting to work on a draft of the Department of Energy's Office of Science Reauthorization. Almost every federal program has to be reauthorized, that is, has to be given permission by Congress to exist every 3 to 5 years, depending on the program in most cases. DOE Office of Science is up. Two things about this that are noteworthy. One, House staffers have already reached out to IEEE-USA for help, which we've been providing, particularly focusing on research infrastructure that DOE needs to upgrade. Second thing to note here is that the Trump administration has proposed in its annual budget zeroing out this program, this department, on a number of occasions. I think it was 3 budgets. It had its budget either zeroed out or almost zeroed out. And Congress has declined to do that and has actually increased the budget rather nicely. This will give us another opportunity to establish and to sell the program to Congress to make sure it has the support it needs to move forward. So good stuff. My colleague Aline McNall has done a great job representing us on this one. NASA released a couple big policy documents recently, which are available online. They have big, nasty website web addresses, which is why it's not on the screen. But the administration is doing some bold thinking on space, and particularly the commercialization of space, which is good. IEEE-USA has met with NASA and the National Space Council to give them our thoughts on all of this. And NASA just released a strategy paper, which you can see on the screen there, on the International Space Station and commercial low Earth orbit. Again, one of the parts of space that we're most excited about is the commercialization of space. Private companies finding a way to make profit, bringing things and doing things in outer space. If they can do it, and they may actually currently be doing it, totally changes the game in space exploration. And so we're very excited about this. We're excited that the Trump administration has embraced this. Important to note that the Obama administration did exactly the same thing and got the ball rolling really on commercialized space. So this is a nice bipartisan effort that is broad support across Washington, D.C. And, you know, in a society consumed by political strife and argument, this is the kind of thing that can have really long-term impacts. And it's nice to see that this is working and the two parties are actually helping move it forward together. Doesn't make the news, though. I mentioned Science is Us a few minutes ago. This is the Campaign for Science that IEEE-USA was a founding partner in. We've been working for a couple years to build partnerships in a number of states to promote basic research, and most of all to promote the idea in those states that basic research is good for the citizens of those states. And our efforts are starting to pay off. We have a great program going in New Mexico, Iowa, Florida, a couple other places, Wisconsin and Georgia, where we weren't originally going to be active. Groups have already approached us about working with us. But Maine, much to my surprise and enjoyment, is ahead of the pack. Our coalition of partners, which includes a number of business groups in Maine, including the Bath Iron Works, the Maine Chamber of Commerce, and the Maine Wild Blueberry Association. If you've never had wild blueberries from Maine, you are seriously missing out because they are one of the world's great foods. So we have this great partnership built, working with the University of Maine and the IEEE section. The IEEE Maine section already had a good relationship with the University of Maine and the Maine Chamber of Commerce, which made this partnership very easy to build. They are currently preparing a statewide virtual workshop on workforce development needs in Maine, basically saying, okay, how can we attract STEM jobs? How can we attract the jobs of the future to a state that has had problems doing that in the past? IEEE was asked, and we are playing a role in organizing that. The IEEE Maine section is a lead partner on that effort, and they will be speaking at the workshop. And I'm pretty excited. There's no date for the workshop. It should be sometime in October. There's a call in a week or so to get the details down. So I will keep you updated, but it's nice to see that this is starting to pay off with some real effort in the States. Our next update is September 4th. That's the Friday before Labor Day. I went ahead and double checked, just for those of you who are wondering. And in fact, 2 weeks from now, we are in September already, something which I found rather disturbing. I seem to recall abandoning the office just a couple weeks ago and expecting to be back shortly. And here we are several months later. Still, most people aren't back yet, but we're into fall. So September 4th, by that time, both political conventions will be over. The Republicans' convention is next week. We'll start to have some data, some useful data on the presidential polls and some of the congressional races, which we'll talk about a little bit. And we'll have a pretty good sense of what Congress is going to do in its last month of the normal legislative session of the 116th Congress. There'll be some more work done after the election in November and December, but I expect that to mostly be the budget, and that'll be mostly perfunctory. They'll just pass it and go back. They'll go home because everybody will be exhausted after the election. So September 4th, we'll have lots to talk about. 1 o'clock as usual, 1 o'clock Eastern, that is. And as always, I am Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. My phone number is 202-530-8326. Email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. I heard from a number of viewers in the last week with questions about what's going on in Washington. You all know you do not have to wait for these updates. If something is happening in Washington that you're wondering about, send me an email, give me a call. I'd be happy to talk to you whenever it is that you want to talk. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my slides here. Go back over here. There we go. A couple questions on the board here. Do you think with Lyft and Uber suspending their service in California, will that have some impact on the thinking of Democrats on the AB5 issue? An excellent question. A couple things going on here. First of all, my understanding is Lyft and Uber did not, they suspended service briefly, but a circuit court, I believe, approved a temporary injunction preventing the state from enforcing AB5 until the courts could reach a decision on a court case. Lyft and Uber are arguing in court that even under AB5, their employees are still not actually employees. They're independent contractors. So I think that's still in the courts. Excuse me. I haven't seen any evidence that the situation has caused legislators in California to rethink their position. I do know that a number of national Democrats have quietly raised some concerns about this. There's also apparently a referendum on the ballot in November in California that Lyft and Uber got on there. That would exempt Lyft and Uber from AB5, which would be lovely if the two companies the bill is targeted at don't have to comply with it, and all the groups that were accidentally sucked into AB5 still do. So there's a lot going on. The lead champions of AB5 have been very clear that they don't think they need to make any changes, and they still think the bill is wonderful. Things like Uber and Lyft suspending their work will hit regular people who are not independent contractors in ways that I think will increase political pressure to do something if the referendum in November doesn't pass. Mr. Ruth mentioned that some politicians are starting to see support for basic research as a benefit for the re-election prospects. Do you see research being a major priority in this election? No. Not a major one. So if you're talking about this election, you're looking at the presidential politics. The problem is both parties are basically in the same place on basic research funding. Traditionally, the Democrats have been more broadly supportive of increased funding for research. Republicans have been a little bit more concerned about, budget constraints. But the fact is, over the last couple of years, our budgets have gone up fairly well, and the Republicans can, they were there, they voted on it, so they can take credit for that. What I think is happening, and in the long run, it's more important because, Senator Biden will eventually go away. President Trump will eventually go away one way or another. But the members of Congress linger forever. And what we're seeing, and congressional races tend to be much, much more local. So they don't deal with these big issues like global competitiveness and the positioning of America for the next 100 years. They tend to focus on much smaller things. And what we're seeing some signs of is politicians thinking that talking about basic research and research in their district is a good way to get people in their district who are not involved in research to vote for them. And so that's not a major issue, and it probably is never going to be a major issue. And I'm not sure I want it to be a major issue. But if politicians, criticize them all you want, they generally have a good idea of what people are saying on the ground in their district. They have a good, understanding of what the public wants. And if they're hearing the public thinks there's value in this research, that's an enormously promising sign for us. And the fact that we're getting some freshman legislators to sign on to our bill this late in the game. I mean, let's face it, there's no reason to co-sponsor a bill at this point. It's either going to pass or not pass, and you signing on to it's not going to make a difference this late in the legislative session. So if you're signing on now, you're doing it because you want to campaign on it. And that's a good sign. We hope through the Campaign for Science, Science is Us, and IEEE's other efforts to encourage that moving forward. Jonathan, were there other questions? Okay, I don't see any. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Hope your summer is going well, your families are safe and healthy. I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations for IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today. You have my email and phone number. Let me know if I can be of service. Have a good afternoon.